The scream came first, loud, raw, and echoing down the concrete corridor like an alarm. Then came the banging. Over and over. Metal against metal. A voice shouted, "Stop! You'll hurt yourself," but the man on the other side of the steel door didn't stop. His fists pounded until blood smeared the narrow window. The cameras caught everything, the shaking, the yelling, the moment he dropped to his knees and whispered words that no one could hear through the thick glass. Officers rushed in, shields raised, but by the time they opened the cell, the man had already stopped moving. This was ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the United States. A place where silence is louder than any scream. Where people live 23 hours a day alone in cells the size of a bathroom. They call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Here, isolation isn't just part of the punishment, it is the punishment. The man's name was David Cole. He wasn't famous, not a headline criminal, not someone who made the news. But his story would become one of the clearest pictures of what solitude can do to the human mind. A week before the screaming, David had been quiet, too quiet, according to the staff notes. He'd stopped talking during checks, stopped eating full meals. He used to write letters to his sister every week, but lately, his mail slot stayed empty. The guard said he stared at the walls for hours, whispering to himself, tracing lines in the concrete with his finger as if reading invisible words. His cell was simple, gray concrete walls, a small window no wider than his hand, a toilet, a sink, and a steel bed bolted to the floor. Every sound was controlled. Every movement watched. When the lights flicked off at night, the silence pressed down like weight on his chest. 3 years earlier, David had arrived at ADX after attacking an officer at another prison. The report said he was angry, dangerous, and manipulative. But isolation has a way of stripping people down, past anger, past fear, until there's only emptiness. At first, he tried to fight the silence. He sang to himself, shouted words just to hear them echo. He even made up conversations, pretending someone was there. But over time, he started losing track of what day it was. Sometimes, he'd wake up in the dark and think it was morning. Sometimes, he'd speak out loud and not remember what he said. One day, during rec time, David looked up at the small square of sky and whispered, "I forgot what clouds look like." The guard watching from above didn't respond. There were rules about interaction. Too much talk could be seen as giving undue attention. In his few hours outside the cell, he was still alone, inside a concrete pen with wire mesh above it. He'd walk in circles for the full hour, not because he wanted to exercise but because it was the only time his body felt real. He once told a psychologist, "When you don't move, you start to fade. Like you're not a person anymore. Just an idea someone locked up." Back in the cell, the world shrank again. He began to hear faint tapping from another inmate. Morse code, old-school prison language. They traded words like, "You good?" and "still breathing." It became the only thing that made sense. But one day, the tapping stopped. That night, David lay awake staring at the ceiling. He felt something cold crawl inside his chest, a panic he couldn't name. His heart raced, his thoughts scattered. He told himself it was just the quiet again, just the same silence that always came. But this time it felt different, heavier, like the air itself was pressing against him. The next morning, when breakfast slid through the slot, he didn't move. He stared at the tray until the milk warmed and the bread dried. When the officer came for count, David didn't speak. He just smiled, a strange, hollow smile, and turned his face to the wall. The mental health staff tried to check on him later that day. They looked through the small window, saw him sitting perfectly still. When they asked if he was okay, he said, "There's someone in the vent." They didn't see anyone, of course, but he insisted, "They whisper when the lights go out." By the next week, he'd stopped talking again. The guards marked his behavior as withdrawn but compliant. The psychologist noted possible onset of psychosis. In ADX, those notes stack up fast. The prison's isolation policy had been criticized for years, by doctors, reporters, even former officers, but inside these walls, change moved slower than time. The routine was too tight, the rules too old, the control too absolute. then came that night. The one that started with the scream. Officers later said the noise didn't sound like words at first, it was more like pain turned into sound. The cameras showed him pacing in tight circles, hitting the wall with his fists, shouting at the air. When the psychologist reviewed the footage later, she wrote one line in her report: subject appeared to be responding to internal voices. When the officers entered, David was still standing, chest heaving, eyes unfocused. Back up, one of them shouted. Hands behind your back. But he didn't move. He pressed his hands to the wall, whispering something none of them understood. Then his body went rigid, and he collapsed. Medical rushed in. CPR. Oxygen mask. Nothing changed. His eyes stayed open, fixed on the ceiling light. The next morning, the warden ordered a review. The official cause was listed as cardiac failure, but among the staff, people whispered a different kind of explanation, one you couldn't write in a report. They said the silence killed him. After David's death, new rules were discussed: more mental health checks, more time out of the cell, softer lighting. But everyone knew it wouldn't fix what was already broken. Because for most inmates still inside ADX, isolation wasn't a temporary state. It was a life sentence of the mind, and deep down, every man on that range knew one truth: if you stayed here long enough, the cell stopped being a room. It became part of you. But what no one expected, what even the staff didn't see coming, was that the silence David left behind wouldn't stay empty. 2 nights after his death, the guard on the late shift swore he heard tapping again. Slow, steady, coming from inside David's old cell. He unlocked the observation screen, leaned closer, and froze. The cell was empty. The tapping continued. The sound came again. Slow. Careful. Rhythmic, tap, 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 tap. Officer Miller stood still, his flashlight trembling slightly. The other guards had already done their rounds. The cameras showed nothing unusual. But there it was, clear as a heartbeat, coming from behind the door of cell B, 214. David Cole's old cell. He stepped closer, shining the light through the observation slot. The cell was empty. The bed was clean, sheets folded military style. The air looked still, thick with quiet. Yet the tapping didn't stop. Miller's radio crackled, making him flinch. Range check complete, a voice said. He pressed the button and whispered, stand by. I think I'm hearing something in 214. Static. Then the voice came back, calm but cold. No one's housed there, Miller. Check your surroundings. He swallowed. Copy that. But his heart was pounding too hard to believe it was nothing. He leaned closer to the door. Hello? Silence, then, one more tap. Soft, almost gentle. Like a reply, Miller stepped back and decided not to log it. Some things, in this place, were better left unwritten. 2 weeks later, the cell was reassigned. The new inmate's name was Thomas Reed, age 38. He'd been transferred from a federal prison in Illinois after multiple violent incidents. The file described him as unstable, unpredictable, and in need of controlled environment supervision. In other words, ADX material. Thomas entered the cell carrying a small box of property, 2 letters, 1 Bible, 1 photo of his daughter, and a cheap paperback book with the cover torn off. When the door sealed behind him, he looked around slowly. The concrete walls were bare except for faint marks, like scratches that had been covered and repainted. He placed his box on the floor, sat on the steel bed, and whispered, so this is it. That night, he couldn't sleep. The silence was heavier than anything he'd known. No footsteps, no voices, not even the hum of conversation. Just air and emptiness. He tried reading, but the letters on the page blurred. He tried praying, but the words wouldn't come out. Then, around midnight, he heard it, tap, 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 tap. He froze. His first thought was plumbing. Pipes. Maybe air moving through vents. But it sounded too deliberate, too spaced out. He pressed his ear to the wall. Tap, tap, pause, tap. He whispered, who's there? Nothing. He lay back down, but sleep never came. By morning, his nerves were raw. When breakfast came through the slot, he jumped. The officer slid the tray and said, "Welcome to Florence." No smile, no emotion. Just routine. Over the next few days, Thomas tried to ignore the noise. But the more he tried, the louder it seemed to get. Sometimes it came from the wall, sometimes from the floor, sometimes from the ceiling. Always at night. Always the same rhythm that he started writing notes to the psychologist during his weekly check-ins. At first, they were simple: "Can't sleep. Noise in cell." Later, "Voices in vents. Talking about me." The responses were always the same. Environmental sounds. Stress reaction. Practice breathing. He tried. But every time the lights went out, the whispers began. Sometimes, they sounded like his own thoughts spoken aloud. Other times, they repeated his name, softly, slowly, like someone calling from the end of a long tunnel. "Thomas." He would press his hands over his ears, whispering back, "You're not real. You're not real." But even then, he wasn't sure. The guards noticed the change. He stopped talking during rounds. He stopped eating full meals. He began pacing in tight circles, mumbling to himself. When they opened the food slot, he would freeze and stare, eyes wide like he was waiting for something that never came. Psych staff increased his observa. Tie-in checks. They logged deteriorating mental state due to isolation stress. But reports like that filled entire filing cabinets at ADX. Nothing new. One afternoon, a counselor asked him gently through the door, "Thomas, can you tell me what you're hearing?" He looked up, eyes hollow. "He's still here," he said. "Who?" "The man before me. He doesn't stop talking. He says the silence is hungry." The counselor glanced at her clipboard, writing down his words, but inside she felt a small chill. She knew about David Cole. Everyone did. The file had been closed, but stories like his stayed alive in the walls. Days turned to weeks. Thomas began marking time by the light through his window. He scratched tiny lines into the wall each morning to remember the days. But soon, he stopped knowing what day it was. One night, during the 2 a.m. round, Officer Miller, same one who'd heard the tapping before, stopped at Thomas's cell. He saw him standing in the middle of the room, whispering to the vent. Miller spoke through the door. "Reed. You okay?" Thomas didn't answer. "Reed?" Thomas slowly turned. His eyes were wide, glassy. "He says you can't leave either," he whispered. Miller frowned. "Who?" But Thomas just pointed to the wall. The officer logged it as psychotic episode, requested a wellness check, and moved on. But he couldn't shake the image. That same night, during camera review, he saw something that made him sit up straight. The security footage showed Thomas lying on the bed, motionless. Then, faintly, barely visible, something on the far wall flickered. Like a moving shadow, bending against the light. It lasted only half a second. The system timestamp glitched right after .by the next morning. Thomas had stopped eating completely. When officers entered his cell for a wellness check, he was sitting cross-legged on the floor, eyes fixed on the vent. "Thomas, we need you to stand up," one officer said. That he didn't move. "Thomas, now." He blinked, slow and tired. Then, in a flat voice, said, "He's not go. Any. He just moved next door." Later that day, another inmate on the same range refused his meal, saying he'd heard a man crying in the pipes. But maintenance found nothing. The air vents were clean, the ducts empty. The prison psychologist, Dr. Elaine Parker, added one note to the report: "Prolonged isolation has created overlapping psychotic patterns across adjacent inmates. Recommend increased out-of-cell time and monitored interaction." The request was denied. Security risk, the memo said. That night, the power flickered again. Cameras reset. The corridor went dark for 3 minutes. When the lights came back on, Officer Miller returned to the monitors. Every cell looked the same, except one. In Thomas Reed's cell, the words, "He's still here,"